All right, so away we go. So this week's question, we're talking about the question, what is Islam? And so as I typically do with classes that ask questions about traditions that are not my own, I want to just give you my standard disclaimer that I cannot speak for any Muslims, let alone all Muslims. So I want you to take everything that I say with a grain of salt. However, most of what I am going to offer here comes from classes that I have taken with professors who are Muslim. And so this is kind of secondhand information, but at least it's not, me mostly gleaning from the internet and trying to hopefully get the right information. I was taught about Islam by several different people who are Muslims and many of whom grew up in the Middle East. And so hopefully what I have to say is fairly accurate, if not, what am I looking for? Unchallenged. That, obviously people have different interpretations, and I'm mostly, inspired by the people who taught me. And so sometimes I'll say things that are opinions and I won't even know it's an opinion. So that's part of kind of the limitations that we have when we're studying other people's cultures and traditions. But hopefully I won't at least say anything that's downright false to you today.
Were these, of all of them, were they all practicing Muslims, or did they?
Not all.
Okay.
Some, one of my professors who taught Intro to Islam was a practicing Muslim and probably still is, and she was one of the ones that was the most influential for me. But I took an anthropology class on peoples and cultures of the Middle East from a gentleman who was not a practicing Muslim, but spent a lot of years living in Egypt. And so he had a kind of an interesting perspective. He taught at the American University in Cairo. And so he was an anthropologist. So he studied kind of from an outsider's perspective and in a regimented and scientific kind of way. So different perspectives and interesting differences, but hopefully has allowed me to kind of conglomerate and come to some basic understanding, at least for an hour to hour and a half class to cover what should hopefully be said. So when we get started with a new question, what we always want to do is start with our assumptions that kind of come with the question. And so because Islam is a tradition and a religion that we in the West, and even the word using the word West has a lot of baggage that comes with it. We Christians in the United States don't really know very much about it. I wanted to start just thinking about how we define a religious tradition and thinking about that from our own perspective of Christianity. So let's put aside the question for a couple minutes and think about, how do we define a religious tradition? What does it mean to be a Christian?
Following what's in the Bible, following what Jesus taught.
Yeah, so there are scriptures, maybe. There are traditions or mythologies that we follow, we believe are true in some way, whether that truth is literal, historical truth, or interpretation in terms of finding meaning in the world. Those traditions and scriptures and practices are part of what makes us Christians. Any other possibilities?
I'm trying to think of how, from my own perspective, I guess it's a lot of what you said, but it's how you were taught from whatever church or, entity you were raised in, how you define Christianity from a Catholic's point of view, or a Baptist, Methodist, Presbyterian, Lutheran, that's a tradition, obviously. Yeah. So, supposedly, presumably based on the Bible, but how that Bible is interpreted
Right. And that's a really important point because we tend to see Islam as kind of a unified, one-dimensional type of thing. And it definitely is not, in the same way that in Christianity, we've got lots of different denominations and sects and disagreements on how you interpret, even though you have the same basic, set of scriptures that you're working from. It's the same thing when it comes to Islam. There are going to be people who are wildly liberal in their politics and in their, social understanding, who believe that they are the correct interpreters of their Islamic traditions. And then there are going to be people who are wildly conservative in their politics and their economics and their social understanding. And they're going to think that they're the ones who are correct. And so we have to be aware that, people are people and people all have different perspectives. And for as many people as you talk to, you're going to get a different understanding of what is Islam. So what I'm going to tell you is going to be kind of the most generic and the kind of highest level understanding, but there are lots of different understandings and even historical disagreements and splits in the Muslim tradition, just the same as there is in Christian history and tradition. So good. What about how we behave? Are we defined by our ethics, by the way that we allow that religion to make a difference in our lives? And then if that's the case, when we're trying to define Christianity, do we look at the behavior of people who say that they're Christians and then kind of from there describe what they're doing and say, well, that must be what it means to be a Christian? Or do we look at the scriptures and the traditions and prescribe, tell people how they should be behaving? Or is it kind of a mixture of both? If we're studying and asking the question, what is Christianity? And we look out, into the world and we say, hey, somebody over there has claimed that they are a Christian and that the reason why they just bombed that abortion center is because they are Christians and they don't think that, people should be able to have abortions. And so I guess one of the ethics of Christianity is that if you don't agree with someone, you get to murder them. Is that appropriate? Is that a correct interpretation of what it means to be a Christian? And a lot of times that's what we do when we're looking at traditions that we don't understand or that we don't know very much about. We look at what we can find, which is usually the news, which is usually, the worst of any particular group's elements, because we want sensation in our news. And then we say, oh, well, that must be what it means to be that part of that group or an adherent of that particular religious tradition. So we have to be really careful about how we're defining these things if we're using observation, anthropological or sociological tactics to come up with what a particular religion means. We've definitely got political and social and cultural elements that are involved in this as well. Where when I started hanging out with the Lutherans, they would joke a lot about green Jello. And I did not understand what they were talking about at all.
Him doesn't either.
I didn't, and I mean, I'm not from the Midwest, which is where like the kind of cultural American Lutheranism comes from. And so I'm already even an outsider to that, but then I'm also an outsider to Lutheranism. And so on the East Coast, where they don't eat green Jello all the time, they still make jokes about green Jello and Lutherans. And so
I thought it was red Jello.
Nope, it's green.
Green Jello.
Okay.
And so when we have these cultural things and we kind of have these inside jokes, we have to think about those things. How does the culture play into what it means to be a Lutheran or to be a Christian? Do I have to eat green Jello to be a Lutheran? What if I don't like green Jello? Does that mean that I'm not Lutheran or I'm not fully Lutheran or there's something wrong with me and I have to go and find a different tradition or different religion to adhere to? Or is green Jello just kind of incidental? Oh, well, because this group of people happened to get together and start eating green Jello and they were all Lutherans, and over the course of time the green Jello eating and the Lutheran identities kind of started to gel together, and so we could pull the green Jello away and still have the core of what it means to be Lutheran left over. but what, and that's an easy example, but there are other things too that, what is essential to being a Christian and what kind of excludes you from being a Christian. Do you have to be baptized as an adult? Do you have to choose God in order to really be a Christian? If that's the case, I'm not a Christian because I was never baptized as an adult. I was baptized as a baby. And so does that mean that I'm not a Christian? And that's a legitimate argument that different Christian sects, denominations have with each other about what it means to be a Christian. So even within the tradition, we can't agree on how to define it. And so we have to keep that in mind as well when we're thinking about this kind of stuff.
I think that's something that people who aren't religious haven't decided. Maybe they believe in God. They don't. They see all this kind of stuff and they go, all of this stuff, whatever religion is all just kind of more tradition and myth than actual fact.
Then one last thing I wanted to bring up before we move on into actually talking about Islam is it's called the Edward Said theory, and this is just the person who came up with this idea.
Okay,
And
I'll be right back.
okay, what he says is that how the world is studied is defined by its politics, by how it's ruled. And so he's writing in the 1970s when a lot of the Middle East was still controlled by European countries. And so kind of the point that he was making was that when we're trying to understand a culture and the book that we're reading about that culture is written by people who are in power and not by the people who identify as part of that group, then what is the purpose of the study? Is it really to understand something that is other than you? Or is it to be able to control and have that and maintain that power by understanding and being able to manipulate that information and that understanding? And so when we're thinking about, how do we understand Islam and where do we get our information about Islam, we have to be careful to think about who is doing the interpreting of the culture and what it means, and what are they choosing to share and not to share, and what is their point? What are they trying to accomplish? Because not always, but typically, when someone who's in power is trying to study someone that is under their control, even if they don't acknowledge it to themselves, they are interpreting and sharing information that is going to help to get the best outcome for themselves in terms of building their power, arguing for their, ethical rightness in controlling this group, etc. And so this idea of us versus them, and why are we studying, and when we get new information, why was that person who is providing the information, why are they providing that information? Why were they even seeking it in the first place? When we look at the news, the news is certainly not a good source of information about religion, because what is the point of the news? It's to create sensation, to get more viewers, to make more money off of your ads, right? And so if we're only getting our information about Islam from the news, then we're going to think that Islam is all about these sensational, awful things that are happening in this particular part of the world, because nobody's going to do a news article about, Joe Schmo who just lived his regular life and did his prayers and, helped out a poor person that was on the street today. That's regular life for a Muslim, just like it's regular life for us. But we're not going to hear about that. And so we have to really consider and critique the sources of the information that we're getting when we're trying to access something that is other than us. So I think that's really important for us to keep in mind as we go through this. So any questions about any of that before we jump into some Islam history?
No, it seems like that's just about true about anything that historical.
Yeah.
The adage is, well, it's in a history book, so it must be true.
Right.
It is not exactly. It's like when three people see an accident, they all see an accident. They all see that, but I'm standing here, you're standing there, and somebody else is standing over there. We all saw the accident, but we saw it from different perspectives. So if I didn't see something that you did, does that make you a liar or me a liar or not a truth?
Yeah.
And history is, when you look at history through that lens, then you get a better perspective of, okay, this person was here and this person stood there, and they went through it's even the same thing in a family of 5 kids. They see an event in their life, but this one is 16, this one is 12, this one is, it's depending on their age, how they viewed that event and their ability to understand. They all saw the same thing. They all felt, went through the same thing, but they see it in different lights.
Yeah, and their intention, why am I experiencing this, or what do I kind of want to get out of this? A 16-year-old might see an event and say, oh, well, this is a good excuse for me to, be angry with my parents because that's the age that I'm in right now. And so that would be how I would interpret that. And then therefore my behavior is going to be, oh, well, I'm angry with you, this is your fault, that kind of thing. Whereas a 3-year-old would see a traumatic event and cling to the parent more because this is the source of my comfort and stability in the face of this, traumatic event or negative event or whatever it is that they have observed and witnessed together. And so our intentions, our background, our training, our personal histories, our experiences, all these things influence how we interpret events, even that we've seen. And then we're trying to kind of do the same thing, except we're doing it even from a secondary or sometimes even tertiary place where somebody else is the one that's interpreting the events for us. And then we're supposed to take that and interpret it for our own understanding and how we're going to behave in relationship to that topic. And so
and take it as gospel.
Yeah, very dicey, very dicey. All right, so let's move on to, what happened? There we go. So the rest of this class, because we're looking at just what is Islam, I'm going to run it kind of through a historical lens and talk about things as they occurred in history and bring up some cultural and some religious ritual and things like that throughout this, but this will kind of just frame our time. So we're going to start with some information about early Islam and the kind of development of Islam, which of course actually starts before Islam in the pre-Islamic Arabian Peninsula. So I have a pretty picture here for you of what that looked like in terms of who was in power. And you can see that in the middle of the Arabian Peninsula, there are not any colors, it's all white. And the reason for that is because there's nothing there. It's all desert. There's very little water. There's very little places that are, available for people to actually live and thrive and get their needs met. And so generally speaking, because of the climate, because of the geography, in the pre-Islamic era, there was not a lot of consolidated power. There were tribes, tribal politics, intertribal politics, and so each tribe had its own god or gods that they worshipped and they worked with. And then to the north, you can see that there are 2 different empires going on at this period. The one that is pink, that is to the east, was at that time the Sasanian Empire. And so they had the influence and culture of Zoroastrianism, of the former Persian Empire. This was kind of the Iraq-Iran area of what is now the Middle East. And then to the west, we had the Byzantine Empire, which was Roman, which was Christian. And so they had, even though they're way over there in what is now Turkey and northern Egypt, and along the Western Mediterranean or the Eastern Mediterranean wall, that was actually a Christian area at the time that Islam was developing. It was the eastern part of the Christian empire, but it was still dominated by Christians. So this is kind of the political and religious and economic landscape into which Islam developed. There's
What period of time was this? Was it
600, about 600.
okay?
So this is
Okay.
this is the Dark Ages, if you will. I don't really like
Okay.
to call it that because that's not a very good description, but in general sweeping European history, we call this the Dark Ages in Europe.
Okay.
There's not really much going on
Okay.
in Europe. So this is about 600. So into this climate of these two empires that are battling with each other and warring with each other and invading to try to get resources from the south that they can use against each other, and then all of these tribes that are kind of interfighting and disagreeing and trying to control each other and get kind of get the upper hand on each other. Into this environment is born this guy named Muhammad. And Muhammad was part of a merchant tribe. He was from the tribe of Quraysh. Can you see my arrow when I bring it over here?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, cool.
Yes.
All right. So Quraysh is the tribe that's kind of right here, and they controlled this little space right here, Mecca. Mecca is the city. And at this time, Mecca was the kind of a merchant center, a trade center. And because of that, it also became a religious center. So there was this building, this box, this black box called the Kaaba. And in this box, a lot of the tribes kept their gods, their idols, their shrines and things like that, for them to be safe, because they came through Mecca a lot. And so they kind of stored their religious symbols there. And so Mecca was important not just as a place where there was a lot of trade going on, but there was also a lot of cultural discussion and interchange and religious interchange. But it was very much based on kind of a wealth building type of value. And Muhammad really had a problem with that. He just felt like this material culture was not satisfying for him in his soul. And so he started to take trips out into the wilderness a lot to just meditate and be on his own. And in the year 610, he was hanging out in a cave outside of Mecca, because it's really hot there, so he's probably in the cave to cool off. And according to tradition, this was when he received his first revelation or vision from God in the form of the angel Gabriel. And the content of this vision was the words, "Recite in the name of your Lord." And it was in Arabic, of course, so we could understand it, but that was what the message was. And so he went back home and he told his wife about this and some of his friends, and he decided that this vision was real, that this really did come from God. And so what God had told him to do was recite, to share this information. After this, Muhammad had many more revelations in which he was given the word of God, the literal word of God. So these revelations were what was eventually written down and became the Quran. So the holiest scripture of the Muslim people is the Quran, and this is where those words come from. They literally came from the mouth of God through the angel Gabriel most of the time, and to Muhammad.
So how big is this Quran?
It's I would say it's probably, in terms of when you publish it, it's probably equivalent to our Bible. The Quran is not it's not narrative, it's not stories or letters or anything. It's poetry, and so it probably has fewer words than the Bible, but in terms of when you print it up, it especially if you add in some study types of resources and things like that, it's pretty much about the same size as your standard Bible.
But it's not broken up into chapters and things of that.
So it's broken up into they're called surahs, and they are just the different revelations that Muhammad received, kind of different poems. So it's like if you have your book of sonnets from Shakespeare, and each sonnet is its own own
Right.
unit, but it's
Right.
all in, all in one book. Kind of like
And so the Quran is just God speaking to Muhammad. It's not like our Bible where the different prophets and had visions and okay.
great. That's the understanding and the tradition. So they haven't written any of this down yet, but Muhammad is kind of receiving these visions and these revelations and these words from God. And so he starts to share these messages that God is giving him through conversation with the people nearest to him. So it's natural that the first converts to this new understanding of God are his wife and his cousin Ali, who is a close friend of his as well. And most of the content of these early revelations had to do with who God is and how we should live our lives in relationship to who God is. So the emphasis that there is one God, which was really scandalous to the people who Muhammad would have met, because they had all their tribal gods and their ancestors that they worshiped and all these things. And so the idea that you could only have one God was not revolutionary. The Byzantine Empire is right there, so the Christians are nearby. There are Jews living everywhere in this region, and so the idea of one God is not revolutionary, but it is it's challenging to the tribal God system that had been in place for a really long time. Muhammad also emphasized the moral and social message. So it's about changing your behavior. Materialism is bad. Stop all of this greed from the merchants that are in Mecca. Stop the exploitation of the poor, and remember that the afterlife is a thing, that judgment day is coming, and that you need to change your ways and behave in the way that God is calling you to behave. So this is kind
very similar to how we interpret God.
Yes. So in about 613, so this is 3 years after that first revelation, Muhammad decided that he was going to go public and start preaching widely. He starts teaching these revelations to his followers, and how they understood that you were supposed to form yourself in this was to memorize and recite. Remember, that very first revelation was recite in the name of the Lord. And so it's formation through repetition. You memorize and then you recite. And by reciting the words and having them kind of be part of your heart, that is how you affect the way that you behave in your life and what you believe. And so it's not really that surprising that the earliest converts to what it's not called Islam yet, but to what eventually became Islam, were the weak elements of society. People who were suffering under the current status quo, young men, slaves, people like that, because Muhammad was calling on the people of wealth to stop being greedy and to care about these people who were suffering. And so obviously they would like that message. As in opposition to that, the people who had the power would not have liked this message. And so it makes sense that a lot of opposition would have arisen. Some people just dismissed him as some crazy kook guy, but others were insulted by what he was saying. If it's true that you have to believe that there's only one God and you have to behave in certain ways, then what you're telling me is that all of my ancestors who did not believe this stuff that you're telling me are all in hell, that they've all been judged harshly and poorly because they didn't even know about this stuff. So that's problematic when you are in a culture that really reveres your ancestors. Some are skeptics. Some think that that it doesn't make any sense, that why would this particular person get chosen to receive the word of God and these miracles and these revelations, and why now, why here, why this guy, those types of things.
So Muhammad was also a humble man. I mean, more on the poor side.
Yeah, so
maybe?
he was kind of like middle-ish class
Okay.
for his society, and in terms of the politics of the day, he was a member of that very powerful Quraysh tribe.
Oh, okay.
But his particular subgroup was not very powerful, and so he kind of had he had enough protection to be able to say this stuff without getting himself killed. but not enough protection that he would, just buy into what was going on and agree with it. And that's why he, ended up having these revelations, because he kind of had withdrawn himself from that mainstream culture. So within another 5 to 7 years, there was a lot of opposition growing, and a lot of powerful opposition growing in Mecca. And so Muhammad actually ended up leaving. He had to flee Mecca. And luckily, around the same time, he was invited to go to another city called Medina. So in our map here, we've got Mecca down here, and then up here, we've got Medina. So he fled to the north to Medina. And the reason he was asked to go to Medina was because they were having a feud among the 11 clans that made up the city. And they had heard that he was a wise person, that he could help them to mediate and fix this feud so that people would stop killing each other. And in exchange, Medina would accept Muslims into their community. So you didn't have to be afraid to be a Muslim, because you were protected by the culture, by the government there. And so this is called the Pact of Medina, and the establishment of the idea that we are all one united community. So we have this political backlash in Mecca, but now Medina has established Islam as a legitimate religion. A few years later, war broke out between Mecca and Medina. And so there's this war going on, and the Muslims from Medina ended up conquering Mecca in the year 630. So from 610, when these revelations started, just 20 years later, Muhammad has now conquered 2 different cities with his people and has taken control of those cities. So this is the earliest days of the development of Islam. Then in 632, just 2 years after Mecca has been conquered by the Muslims, and Islam is made an official religion, probably at this point the official religion, Muhammad died. Muslims had, by this point, overcome the entire Arabian Peninsula. So within 20 years of the founding of this thing, they went from this little impoverished group of people who had to flee from Mecca and take the charity of another city to survive, to conquering the entire Arabian Peninsula. And then Muhammad died. Muhammad had no sons. And so there was a big disagreement over how succession would work in this new tradition. Does it have to be a blood relative of Muhammad for it to be legitimate? And if so, his closest blood relative would be his cousin Ali, especially because his cousin Ali married his daughter. And so their children would be the closest thing to male heirs that you could get for Muhammad, since he didn't have any male heirs. Or should the succession have nothing to do with bloodlines, and should it be a person who is kind of chosen by the people, who is raised up by God from within the community to be the next leader? And this is one of the most basic of divisions within Islam. People who adhere to the idea that a blood relative needs to be the next leader are called Shia Muslims. And people who believe that the leader does not have to be a blood relative and should be either chosen by the people or chosen by the leaders, or even chosen by the person that is preceding them, are called Sunni Muslims. And today, the Sunni contingent is by far the largest in terms of population of Muslims. Sunni Muslims make up most of Iraq. And the Shia Muslims are they are a minority group, but they're still fairly large. And there are a lot of them in Iran. So you've got kind of the Iraq-Iran conflict going on there that is really old. It goes all the way back to this disagreement about who to make Muhammad's successor. So they argue about this for a while. And then eventually Abu Bakr, who was a close friend of Muhammad's, but not a blood relative, becomes the caliph, is what they called it. And caliph means successor or substitute. So caliph doesn't mean king or leader or anything. It means the successor, the substitute, the person who stands in for the person who should be the leader, but unfortunately he's dead now, so we have to do something here to have leadership. And Abu Bakr was actually a pretty good leader. He waged lots of wars. He conquered a lot of land, and over the course of over time, even though the first 4 or 5 caliphs were actually really good at spreading their power, spreading their land ownership, spreading their influence, and then therefore spreading Islam. By the year 661, so this is only 50 years since the first revelation, the 5th caliph establishes a dynasty in Damascus, in Syria. And so now they have started to push up, not just in that area that's kind of unclaimed because there's not really anything there, but they've started to push up into the northern empires that have been established for a long time and have started to become a real potential threat to those empires. They have their own empire now, and that only took them 50 years to accomplish. At this point, there is a period of great cultural and economic growth. This is, as I mentioned before, this is the Dark Ages, quote unquote, in Europe, but this is not the Dark Ages over the course of the world at this point, because the Muslim world is thriving, is growing. There's a lot of interest in math and science. There's a lot of interest in Greek philosophy. The only reason that we as Europeans have access to thinkers like Pythagoras and Plato and Aristotle is because of the Muslims, because they kind of rediscovered this stuff, decided that Greek was important, decided that these guys had something important to say, and started to translate into Arabic what the Greek thought, what the ancient Greek thinkers had to say. And so that's where we get, Muslims created math as we understand it today. You remember your Roman numerals; those are impossible to work with. The numbers that we have today in our culture come from Arabic. They're from the Muslim tradition. A lot of our sciences come out of this period, again, from the Middle East, from these cultures that are blossoming and thinking rationally and thinking about all of these different ideas. But by the 800s, there was kind of a sense within the dynasty, within this empire, that they needed more organization. They needed more religious organization that could help people to sort out their lives and make good decisions, and be a little bit more specific in terms of what are we supposed to be doing here. This is the kind of process of growing from a movement into an institution. You can have a movement where there's a very basic message, but once people start to really buy into it and it starts to get big, then you have to figure out, okay, well then what does all this mean for my life? But the Muslims didn't want to just make up laws and make up an organizational structure for themselves. They wanted those laws to come from God. And so they developed this process called Sharia. And I'm sure that you've heard that word before, because we here in America think that it is a terrible, naughty word for Muslim law and control and domination and brutalism and dictatorship. But Sharia actually means path.
It means what?
P-A-T-H.
Oh.
Like follow the path. You can't make up the Sharia, which eventually became, it eventually changed from just meaning path to actually meaning the end of the path, which was the laws that were developed. So you can't make up the laws, but you have to find it through a process that you believe God is drawing you through, this path that you must take. So you can find the Sharia by interpreting traditions. You can find it by conversing with other scholars and kind of coming up to a consensus together. You can use reason or analogy with other laws to come up with new laws, but you can't just say, I want this to be a law and make it so. You have to go through this process of discernment and figure out in the best of circumstances, you're opening yourself up to kind of how God wants you and your culture and your society to address this particular issue that is not currently addressed in the Sharia, in the law along this path.
During any of this time where the growth, this last 200 years of the growth, did anybody else hear from God like Muhammad did? Just him. Okay.
Yeah, so Muhammad is the last of the prophets. Muslims believe that a lot of characters that we are familiar with, Abraham, Moses, Jesus, are also prophets, and that they did this kind of the same thing that Muhammad did in terms of seeing how things were going in the world and seeing how what God wanted was being skewed and corrupted, and so they came along to bring people back to the original message. Okay. And so these characters appear in the Quran, and the stories about them are slightly different. Sometimes they're very similar, sometimes they're very different. But Muhammad is the last prophet, and so there is no expectation that anybody will ever receive a direct revelation from God again. So as we're developing this law stuff, I think there are the kinds of laws that you would expect. There are laws about God and rituals. There are laws about interacting with people in the world. And then there are laws kind of judging and categorizing types of actions and behavior. And so there are 5 different levels of actions and behaviors and how they're categorized. The top one is obligatory, things that you must do to be a good Muslim, and if this law is also used for political rule of the government, then you must do as a member of the society, as a citizen. Things like you must participate in the prayers that happen 5 times a day. You must support your children and raise them well so that they can be good members of society. Then there are things that are considered to be good things for you to do, extra prayers beyond the obligation, being a good neighbor, things that help the society but aren't necessarily required of you because they were not instituted directly by Muhammad, or they're not seen as essential pieces of the society. Then there are things that are indifferent. You can make the decision whether you're going to drink milk or orange juice for breakfast. You can make the decision whether you're going to walk or take the bus to work today. Those things are indifferent. You can make whatever decision you want, but they have no moral or ethical meaning to them. Then there are categories. There's the category of things that are bad. Being wasteful or lazy or greedy are things that are bad. And then there are things that are forbidden. You cannot do. Polytheism. There's only one God, so you cannot worship other gods. Adultery, murder, things like that you can't do. And so you kind of have to figure out who you are and live your life within these boundaries. You must do the obligatory things. You cannot do the forbidden things. But then there's some room in between to figure out,
What about when they kill people, when they kill their daughters because they've been, I don't know, they've ruined the family's reputation.
So that is a particular, particular fundamentalist, radical, Islamicist type of group that does things like that.
Okay.
And they would say that they are not murdering anyone because the law is that I must do this. In the same way that Leviticus has some stuff about killing people who commit adultery and things like that. That's not murder. Or in our society today, we
justice.
We allow the state on our behalf to kill people who have received the death penalty, and that is considered justice, not murder. So it's kind of the same thing in that culture. That
they're like the fundamentalist Mormons that are out there that have 8 wives and 25 children.
Yeah, and so for them, that's not adultery, right? Because their position is that these are all legitimate marriages. And so it's all different interpretations, right? So the law itself, the Sharia, can say adultery is wrong, but one culture can say, okay, well, I'm not committing adultery even though I'm married to 6 different women because that I'm legitimately married to them, and I'm not committing adultery there. Another culture can say, no, you only get one spouse, and anybody that you sleep with outside of that relationship is adultery. So it depends on where you're living and your political positions and how you interpret all of this stuff.
So our human side starts taking over which of these laws they pick and choose to, just like any other religion.
Yes.
We choose to pick and choose these because it fits our narrative.
Right. Correct. All right. So more questions about that, or are we ready to move on to the next part?
We can move on.
So something else that started to develop during this time was not just the law in terms of how you behave in society and kind of things that would go a little bit more with the government, but also the religious law, the religious practices that are important to you. In Christianity, we tend most of the time to focus on orthodoxy, correct belief. You must believe certain things in order to be a Christian. In Islam, there's a much heavier emphasis on orthopraxy, what you do, correct practice. And I'm not saying that means that no Muslims care about what they believe or, that there isn't anything that's expected in terms of belief. It's just kind of where the emphasis lies. In Christianity, we say that anybody who professes Christ as Lord is a Christian, right? But then there are all kinds of extra things that you kind of pile on top of that to turn it into all these different obligations and requests and requirements and things like that. In Islam, they kind of start with the stuff you do. What you do is what makes you a Muslim, and then your belief kind of follows from that. And so there are these it's called the 5 pillars of Islam that kind of make up the basics of the practices that make you a Muslim. So I'm going to just go through these as quickly as I can to just cover and give you a sense of what the religious life of a Muslim looks like. So the first thing that is the most important and kind of the most basic is the creed. And the creed states there is no God but God, and Muhammad is his messenger. You state this creed, and that makes you a Muslim. And just like with Christians, there's some wackos out there. One of my professors, the one that lived in Egypt for a while but wasn't a Muslim, he told us a story once that he said he was at the pyramids, just doing the tourist thing one time, and he ran into this man, and he hadn't lived there very long yet, so his Arabic was really bad, and the man asked him to repeat something that he was saying in Arabic. And so he acquiesced, and he repeated after him. And then the man said, "Oh, great, you're a Muslim now." And the professor said, "What are you talking about? I'm not a Muslim." And he said, "Well, what I just asked you to repeat was the Arabic creed. There is no God but God, and Muhammad is his messenger. Once you say that, that makes you a Muslim." So obviously that is a very rigid, pedantic kind of interpretation of what it means to recite the creed to make yourself a Muslim. But there are some people out there that believe that. I would say the average person would say that, I recite this to remind myself of my beliefs and to be part of the community and to express to others what it is that I believe. So that's kind of the most basic, the number one thing. The second pillar in Islam is prayer. Muslims are obligated, are required, if they're practicing, to pray 5 times a day. There is a cycle of words and motions that they are supposed to do, and depending on who you are and where you are in your life, you're supposed to do those cycles so many different times. Sometimes, when there's like a high holy day or something, you do the cycles more so that you can spend more time on it and really, get into it. But the intention of the prayer 5 times a day is to disrupt the flow of your day, to help you to focus your attention on God at certain important points in the day. So, before you get up, kind of after lunch, as the day is ending, after sunset, and at night, before you go to bed, all of these are times when you're supposed to stop what you're doing and focus your attention on God. And most of the time throughout the week, you can do this pretty much anywhere. You bring your prayer rug with you, and wherever you are, you can do your prayers. But on Fridays, the prayer is done at the mosque. And the reason for that is not because they have a special worship service like Christians do. They don't understand it in that way. It's kind of the same type of thing, but they do it together to create a sense of community. And so in Muslim dominated countries, everything shuts down so that everybody can go to the mosque on Fridays and have their prayers together. But also all those 5 times a day, everything shuts down so that everybody can stop and do their prayers on their own on the other days of the week. Number 3 pillar is almsgiving. This is out of order from what I was putting. So that's actually the 4th one there. So almsgiving is kind of like tithing. You have the obligation for everyone who can afford it. Poor people don't have to do this, but if you can afford it, you are obligated to give between 2.5% and 10%, depending on what you own and what your wealth levels are. Nowadays, it's often given through charities that are Muslim related. Some of it can go to your local mosque for the stuff that they do. In religious states where the Sharia is considered to be the law of the land, there sometimes the almsgiving is considered kind of part of your government taxes. And if you live in that state and you're not a Muslim, you have to pay different taxes. You're not expected to pay the zakah taxes. You're expected to pay I'm not a Muslim taxes. So there's different types of taxes within a religious state in the Middle East or elsewhere. Fasting is the fourth pillar. And this happens during the month of Ramadan. And what happens is from dawn to dusk, all adults fast unless they can't because they're pregnant or ill or something like that. And what fasting means is that there's no food, no drink, no smoking, no sex from dawn to dusk. And there's a social aspect to this in countries where there are a lot of Muslims. There's a team spirit kind of thing. There's peer pressure to get through it. And then it's also a month where there is a lot of celebrating, because the point of it, it's not really like Lent, in that we look at Lenten fasting as kind of a thing for about sin. It's about penance and kind of restoration. For most Muslims, the fasting in Ramadan is more about showing your loyalty to your faith, to give you an opportunity to focus on your faith, to build community. And so at the end of the day, after sunset, there is a lot of feasting, a lot of celebration, because all day long you haven't eaten or drunk anything, and so you're really hungry and you want to get together with your friends and your family and celebrate that it's finally night and you finally get to eat. And so the fasting that happens during Ramadan is very community based. It's not a kind of personal piety thing like a lot of us understand it to be in Christian traditions. And then the last pillar, which is the most difficult to accomplish, is the pilgrimage. If you can afford it, you are supposed to go on a pilgrimage to Mecca one time in your life as an adult. So if your parents take you when you're a kid, that doesn't count. You have to do it on your own. And it requires a lot of ritual preparation. About 2 million people do this pilgrimage every year. And it is a pilgrimage mostly where you go to Mecca. There are some other travels that you do to Medina and to some other areas in the same region. But there are 3 days of various rituals that are connected to the earliest Muslim traditions. There are traditions and rituals that you do that are related to Abraham and Hagar, and the mythology that Muslims have around those two people, because Ishmael is understood to be the legitimate child of Abraham that makes Muslims connected to Abraham and to that story of God choosing Abraham. And then there are some rituals and traditions related to Muhammad and what Muhammad did and what Muhammad established. It's a lot of really interesting stuff that goes and gets involved with that. But the coolest thing about the pilgrimage is that there are Muslims coming from all over the world. And so it's not just people who are from the Middle East, that all kind of have the same culture and the same eating habits and, the same dress styles. There are people who come from Africa. There are people who come from the Indian subcontinent. There are people who come from America. There are people who come from Europe. And so it's a time for kind of seeing the true unity of the people. Everyone has to wear the same clothes. They all have to wear white and these white robes. And so there's not like the display of wealth. Everybody is equal. And so other than, language barriers, you're there to kind of commune together as a community. You're there to experience this sacred spaces of your faith. And you're there to kind of, again, disrupt your life and focus on your faith for that 3-day journey. So those are the five obligated things that Muslims must do in order to be considered, fully practicing and in good status as Muslims. Any questions about any of those?
Not so much, except that is the head covering as much because of the heat and what they originally had to wear, as it is other in the facial hair, those kinds of things. I know, in Christianity and in the Hebrews, the women covered their hair because they were looked upon as that made, hair was a sexual type of thing, and you covered it to, is that where in that group, is that part of Sharia? Is that part of the pillars?
So we're actually gonna talk about hats in a couple minutes. I have a little thing about hats, but it's all of the above. There are, as time goes on, where a particular cultural tradition or expectation comes from kind of can get very blurry. Is it because even in the pre-Islamic tribal, the nomads needed to cover their heads because it was hot and they were in the desert. And so they would, just take a piece of cloth and stick it on their head and then wrap a band around so that it wouldn't blow off. And that's kind of your basic, that's kind of the basic vision that we have of an Arab, right? There are other types of turban wearing that different cultures do. The facial hair thing, actually, I think, so, I'm not saying that there isn't a tradition of wearing facial hair in especially in particular and more traditional or conservative Muslim groups, but actually there is not a requirement that you have facial hair in Islam, and in terms of like the main understood Sharia. The group that does require facial hair is actually a completely different religion, the Sikhs, that comes out of the Indian subcontinent, and we do get we as Americans mix them up a lot. I don't know if you remember back after 9/11, there were a lot of shootings, and there were unfortunately quite a few Sikhs were murdered because they have an obligation to never cut their hair, including their facial hair, and to wear a turban. And so when people looked at them, because they were brown people with turbans and facial hair, they assumed that they were part of this evil, Islamicist group that's trying to kill all the Americans. And so people would get angry and upset, and a lot of people died and got beat up, and it still happens today, and it's a terrible, terrible thing. But that kind of stereotype of what a traditional typical Muslim man looks like, we actually kind of stole that from a whole different religion, which is interesting and not cool. All right, so continuing on, we're moving now into the 1200s. By about the middle of the 1200s, the caliph system had died out. And when Genghis Khan invaded, the Mongols took over, some of the empire that had been developed by the caliphs. Things kind of collapsed for a while, and then instead of caliphs, there were sultans, and sultan means king. And so this was, the standard understanding of the king ruling at this point. But they didn't rule, large areas. They ruled small areas. So it went back to kind of being more of a regional thing in terms of who was ruling. And people were mostly living by Sharia, which made religious laws into secular laws, into governmental laws. But depending on where you lived, sometimes the religion was part of the government, and so everybody was expected to be a Muslim. In Islam, you can't force someone to convert; it has to be in their heart. And so, if you want to be a full part of the culture, you have to be a Muslim. But if you are not, you're not going to be murdered or ostracized from the society in the way that the Europeans did to the Jews and the Muslims during the Middle Ages. You just have to, pay extra taxes, and you're probably shoved off into a corner somewhere, and you don't get any say in government and things like that. Which is still a big deal, but at least you're not murdered like you would have been in Europe at the time. So sometimes it was that, but sometimes the Sharia was kind of kept separate from the secular law, from the government's laws, but the laws that were made allowed people to be good Muslims through the secular law. So they just made sure that there weren't any conflicts between the Sharia and the government's laws, which is different than the Sharia itself being the law. It's a little bit looser in understanding how closely related the kingdom and Muslim identity were to one another. So at this time, that kind of built up, and depending on where you lived, you had a different understanding of how Sharia worked, and of course that influences groups of people through even today. During this time, the development of kind of the culture and civilization of Islam really established themselves. There was pretty good unity in terms of language. And at this point, Arabic and Persian were the two languages that were spoken by people who lived in the Islamic world. It hadn't spread quite as far as to get into the Indian subcontinent and into the South Saharan region. And so it was pretty easy to kind of have a fairly unified looking culture. Of course, there were urban centers where people would gather and share ideas and influence one another and things like that. But there was diversity in this time because local cultures still existed, and depending on where you came from, and depending on how your sultan was imposing or not imposing the Sharia, that changed how you understood things and that kind of thing. And so there's kind of this give and take between unity and diversity, especially as Islam spread into other places in the world, like the Indian subcontinent, where there are different languages and different cultures that are being influenced by it. And then we get into like the 1700s. So I know I'm kind of skipping ahead really, really fast here. We don't have time to do all of it. Into the 1700s, we start to get the decline of empires. We start to get the changes and advances in Europe that we had not been seeing for a really long time. We have the Enlightenment. We have the beginning of the colonial period. We have the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution. And so now Europe is starting to thrive. And the Muslims are wondering, why are we starting to decline and into these, little kingdoms while Europe advances? And so they started to ask some questions and work towards some reforms and some revivals. But this actually led to some changes in terms of what that unity looked like. So, for example, during this period, a kind of philosophical concept, economic concept called Wahhabism developed in the Saudi Arabia, what is now Saudi Arabia. And it was named after this guy, Wahhabi, and that's why it's called that. But their concern, their thought was that the problem is, the reason why we are not, this mighty, massive empire anymore is because there have been too many new things added to Islam and to our culture for us to be able to be successful and thrive. And so we have to purify our traditions. We have to expel any of these things that have been added on over the course of time. We have to go back to the Quran. Does any of this sound familiar to you in terms of the Christian Reformation? And so they started to do this. And then petroleum was discovered in the Arabian Peninsula. And so Saudi Arabia started getting a ton of money, and they used that money to spread their conservative views, their ideas that we need to expel any new innovations, we need to go back to the basics.
Whoa.
Which of course you don't have to interpret it in a conservative way, but that tends to be what happens, right? That the problem is that we have too much change going on. We need to go back to what we think the original tradition was, even if it wasn't like that. And we have to establish that. And that's the only way for us to survive and thrive and grow in the way that we used to in this golden age that may or may not have actually ever even existed. That sounds familiar too, right? So this is not so different, you and I kind of situation. So that's an example of kind of that reform and revival period. But that was, Wahhabism was not a unifying thing. It was actually a dividing thing, because not everybody did that. And so now we've got like this very conservative group in Saudi Arabia that believes that they're the right ones because they don't have any of this newfangled stuff that's been added to the tradition. But then there are other groups that have their own traditions, their own ideas about what Islam means and how it should be practiced. And so things start to get a little bit more complicated the more of these, attempts to reform happen, which of course is the exact same thing that happened in the Christian Reformation, where we end up with all these different denominations because nobody can agree on exactly what the right way to do things is, right? So as time goes on, we start pushing toward the 1800s, and then we run into imperialism. And this is where we're going to talk about hats. So in that 100 years between 1800 and 1900, by 1910, most of the Muslim world is no longer controlled by its own governments. Most of it is controlled by England, France, and Russia. And so there is this imperial conquest that happens from Europe into these areas. There's this idea that we want to help these people, right? These poor backward idiots in these backward regions. We need to give them Western education. We need to give them Western technology. We need to give them Western weapons so that they can protect themselves from their enemies. We're helping them, right? And then at the same time, there is massive urbanization. So we go from, a lot of people living out in the country and kind of being tribal and cultural within themselves, to lots and lots of people living in cities, being influenced by one another, kind of the melting pot of culture and understandings and interpretations and things like that. And how this played out can actually be seen through hats. So this is why I bring up the hats. So in a place like Turkey, you would see people wearing this, the fez. The fez represented this idea of engaging with the West, learning what we can from the West, and not necessarily just buying everything they say whole hog. For example, in India, there at this time were modernists who thought that we should learn from the West, but we should still be Islamic, that science and religion can and do and should fit together, and that we should purge superstitions from our traditions, but that we should maintain our behaviors and our beliefs and our rituals, and kind of take what we learn from the West and translate that into what it is that we're doing. And so this is kind of that image of, the stereotype here is there's the brown guy in the suit, the Western suit, wearing the fez, and he goes around and he is, he wants to maintain his Muslim identity, his Middle Eastern identity, but he buys into this idea that, what the West has to offer is good and has some good stuff to it that we can learn from and grow from and use to, to advance ourselves. And then there were some others in places like Egypt who would say things like, well, we don't like that these imperials, these imperial systems are coming to us from Europe and taking us over. We are our own people. We are nationalists. We have pride in our nation and pride in our own ability to govern ourselves. And we have the right to do that. And so we don't want to, we don't want to get too involved with this, but we do take some of what they have to say and learn from it a little bit, but we have to be really careful about that. And people who wanted to keep those religious traditions, and some of them even more so than the reformists, who, some people just rejected the West completely. And that was represented by the wearing of the turban. The turban was understood to be kind of the traditional headwear of the Muslim people, of the Arabs. And so that was what you wore if you wanted to kind of project out that you didn't think that these invaders should be here and that we need to be able to govern ourselves and go back to where we were before, our traditional culture, our traditional practices. So even the stereotypes that we have kind of show the diversity of thought and understanding of what it means to be Muslim in this period. So any questions or comments about that?
So what about the women? Why are they wearing headdresses?
So
especially now.
Yes, there is a great variety of reasons for that. There is a sense of, there's a book called Herda and the Status of Women that if you're really interested in that, I would highly encourage you to pick up. It's a really good book to kind of help you understand.
What is it again, Katie?
Herda, P-U-R-D-A-H, Herda and the Status of Women.
P-U-R-D-A-H. Okay.
Yeah. And it talks about some of the issues with women, and I want to be really, really careful in how I talk about this. There are some of these diverse groups that are growing up are looking at their tradition and looking at what they think happened historically and believing that part of the problem is the breakdown of family values and where women belong. Does any of this sound familiar? And so they said, well, the reason why we're in decline, the reason why we're struggling economically, the reason why these outsiders from Europe have been able to conquer us and are controlling us so easily is because we have lost we've lost our moral center, we've lost our compass, because we're doing things like letting women go to school and get out of the house. We are undermining the family unit and the basic social structure of what it means to be, and then whatever means to be Arabic, means to be Muslim, means to be a person of this Middle Eastern area. And so some of that came from that reactionary kind of perspective that we're looking back at what we think happened in the past that made it wonderful and golden and no problems, and we're trying to recreate that, even though that's not actually how it was at that time, which is exactly what happens in Western culture with women. As they try to make advances, we interpret that as a threat to the culture and therefore to the economy and to the politics and things like that. But then there are other places where I'm not going to say that like the Quran and the traditions of Islam never address this, because there are places where you see encouragement of modesty and particular behaviors, but you have to, it's the same way that we have to interpret our Bible. Is it a literal thing that Bible is telling us that all women should cover their hair and never speak and be subservient to their husbands? Or is that, is there a different way to understand that? Is there something else going on there that we can dig a little bit deeper to understand?
So Katie, do the Muslims have much humor in their Quran?
The Quran is not a narrative. It's poetry, and so it's very lofty, but it also kind of lends itself to a lot more interpretation because it's poetry, and so it allows for a lot more diversity of thought. For
We were at a church conference one time, and this fellow was there from the seminary in Berkeley.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, and he was talking about how a lot of the stuff that Jesus, it's just knee-slapping humor, like that part about how women should be quiet. A lot of people don't realize that was Henny Youngman funny. So, and that just gave me this whole new take on some of the stuff that he said, because it was just hilarious. It's just that we've kind of lost that mindset.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't feel that the Muslims have that same hilarity going on.
Well, I don't think you could say that the Quran. I mean, I don't know. I don't, because I'm not in that culture, and I don't, have that historical understanding and background. I don't know. I can't say about the humor part of it. But I mean, in terms of, your average person, you're going to have your people who are angry and bitter and feel like all of their problems can be blamed on Europeans or women who won't stay in their place, or XYZ outsiders who they want to place the blame on instead of looking at themselves, and they they create these idyllic pasts that never actually existed, and decide that the best way for them to succeed is to maintain as much control as possible. And so anybody that's different from them, whether it be because of their gender or because of their social status or whatever, have to be controlled and manipulated by the laws and the way that they interpret their scriptures, so that they feel like they're stuck with it. But there is value in some of that stuff, because it's is it religious? Is it cultural? Is it personal? Is it, about my personal piety? Is it something that makes me feel connected to my culture and my roots? There are a lot of Muslim women who choose to be hijabi, and they feel empowered by that. And so as outsiders looking in, all we see is the women who, are in the full burqa, who are, we assume are completely controlled, and they, are never allowed out of the house. And when they do go out of the house, they have to be completely covered head to toe, because, heaven forbid anybody look at somebody's ankle and all of these things. But there's such a wide variety of understandings and interpretations of that, and what it means. And of course, the rapid changes that have happened in some of these countries, like Afghanistan is a perfect example. They went from very open, very, Western in terms of their understanding of clothing and behaviors, and, women being educated just as much as men, and all these things. And then all of a sudden, they got cut off from that. And this whole new, very dictatorial regime came in. And of course you're going to balk at that, because that's not what, you were raised with, and that's not what you find any meaning in for your life. But that doesn't mean that there aren't other places where, the culture of spending your life, with your family and with the close relatives and friends that you have, and not allowing yourself to be distracted by or influenced by the outside, that doesn't mean that is always negative. And so we have to be really careful about the way that we engage with those types of issues, because we see something and we think that it's just wrong flat out, because it's not what we do. But it's way more complicated than that. Not that I'm saying that, throwing somebody on a fire because their spouse is dead is appropriate in any circumstances, regardless of why they're doing it. So sorry, I can't be more help there.
It's okay.
All right, so moving on, we're almost done here. Islam in the modern era. So we hit the 20th century, and we've got the world wars and the imperialist system collapses. A lot of these spaces that had been conquered by European nations are developed into their own nation states. And so we've got the rise of nationalism, which conflicts with the original divisions. You know, these nation states that were developed and these border lines that were drawn took absolutely no consideration for, you know, divisions of religion, divisions of sect, or divisions of ethnicity, divisions of various types of culture. None of that was considered. It was just, here's your nation state, rule the people that live in this nation state. Here's your nation state, rule the people that live in this nation state. And so that's why you get so much conflict with, you know, with like groups like the Kurds. They are an ethnic minority stuck in a country that doesn't understand them and feels threatened by them. And again, not saying that murdering, you know, entire groups of people is right, but when that's kind of the reality that you're placed in, you're struggling to figure out how to move forward with that. And so I think that almost all of this conflict and garbage that's coming out of the politics of the Middle East right now can be traced back not to things that have been done wrong within, you know, Islam and within the cultural traditions of the place, but because of all of these ideas that have been imposed on them, and then they've been told to just live with this. You know, how do you live with somebody else's boundaries? And how do you struggle through that? And can we go back and look at our own history in Europe and see just how much bloodshed there was until we figured out, you know, who we were and where we were going to draw our lines, and got rid of the groups that, you know, we didn't like, and purged them out, and all those awful things that we've done. So I don't think we're in a place, you know, certainly we can work to change things and to protect people if we see something being done that's wrong, but I don't think that we can judge and say, oh, well, this is clearly an inferior culture or an inferior religion that can't handle this, because we've done just as much, if not more, in our own history as Christians, as Europeans, as Westerners, you know, as Americans. So where was I in my notes? Oh, so then we get to kind of this interesting period where we've got, you know, the rise of nationalism. And so the idea that the nation should be able to rule themselves, and, you know, we have pride in who we are as a nation. But then there's also this kind of new imperialism, this neo-imperialism that is no longer explicit. You know, I am not England coming in and controlling your government, telling you what to do, but there is economic and political manipulation that continues to go on by these European countries, even after they have, you know, theoretically left these countries alone to control themselves. For example, when the British ceded control of the oil fields in Iran to the Iranian government, the British boycotted that oil, and they added sanctions that just absolutely devastated Iran's economy. And so no, the British are no longer, you know, in charge of the oil. They don't come and, you know, pull the oil out of the ground and decide where it's going to go, but they use their power, their clout, to manipulate Iran into behaving in this exact same way that they had been behaving before anyway. And so is that really nationalism? Is that really Iran getting to make their own decisions? Or is that just another version of the imperialism that was already present before? Same kind of thing that happens in Egypt. Egypt used the Suez Canal to wield some military and economic control over their region, which is what any country would do when they have something like that. And Britain and France got angry with them for that, and they were prepared to actually start a war with them until the UN stepped in and stopped them. And so are we really living in an era when these countries can self-govern and make their own choices? Or are these European countries that have all the power, have all the military, have all the technology, have all the money, just using different strategies to continue the same policies that they had before, thinking that, you know, they can convince their people that they're only doing it to protect the people, like 9/11, oh, well, we're invading Iraq because we need to protect our people. Look what happened. Iraq had nothing to do with 9/11, but we were convinced that it did. And so, how do we create a system in which these countries that don't really have any kind of national identity because they've never had that kind of identity before, and still really don't have the control that they need to govern themselves, how do we get from there to a place where these nations are stable and economically secure, and then they don't need things like nuclear bombs to feel like they have some kind of control in their lives. It's so much like, it's like having teenagers. I don't want to say that in a derogatory way toward these nation states, but if you can't, if you tamp down too hard, then of course they're going to act out. Of course they're going to do stuff that you don't like. Of course they're going to be a threat to you. Whereas if we had kind of allowed the people who were going to be affected by these policies and decisions to be part of the conversation from the beginning, then maybe we wouldn't have some of these problems that we have today. Possibly. What do I know? I'm just a theologian from Redding, California. So then we start getting, moving forward from kind of all this stuff that's happening in the post-World War II era, and we enter into the Cold War. And of course, during the Cold War, the United States and Russia want everybody to pick a side. And a lot of that happens in the Middle East. And then political Islam starts to emerge. So we thought, we thought that these Sharia sultanates, kingdoms, were religious political, connections. This is where we really start to get some of the stuff that we are familiar with today. Political Islam is a contrasting political, economic, social construct that contrasts to communism, contrasts to this neo-imperialism where all these outside forces are just manipulating, using their power. And these things are disguised as democracy. Neo-imperialism disguised, oh, well, we're letting them vote for themselves. But we go in and assassinate the leader that we don't like. That's not democracy. That's still imperialism. It's just not as overt and explicit as it used to be. And so during this time, radical movements started to become popular, not just among the leaders of these Muslim countries, but among the people, because there were so many problems with these basically useless puppet governments that were being established. There was a lot of poverty because there was underdevelopment. There's a lot of resentment because people who were told to go to college and get out there into the world and learn and then come back and help us to build ourselves, they all can't find jobs because there isn't anything for them to do when there isn't a culture of education and kind of blue or white collar work available to people. Urbanization. The city can't keep up with how many people are coming in to live in the city looking for a better way of life, looking for the promises of this new nation state to be made reality for them. And then again, the breakdown of family and social and moral relationships. People no longer live in their small villages and communities. They're living in cities. They're leaving their longtime ancestral roots. And so we find threat in that, and we say, oh, well, the answer to all of these problems must be religion. And so people are attracted to these radical conservative movements, these reactionary movements, to use religion as a way to fix all of these societal problems that are growing up that actually were caused by the world politics of the World War II era. And so then we start to get a lot of revolutions. We get the establishment of Islamic governments with politics based on that particular interpretation of Sharia that we have talked about, and that belief that that the Sharia, if it is strict enough and strong enough, can bring us all back to where we should be. The idea that our main leader is God, that our Constitution is the Quran, that we don't need anything besides those things to govern ourselves, which is just plain not true. I mean, you think that the Bible is confusing and difficult to read. Imagine turning it into all poetry and trying to understand that, and use that as a constitution, as a way of governing yourself. That just doesn't work. But people convince themselves that that's what they're doing because all of their ideas are, the logical explanation, but they're just not. Everybody's interpreting all the time. So I do want to note that within these radical revolutions, very rarely did these radical groups, which today we often call Islamist, not Islamic. Islamic refers to the religion. Islamist refers to these radical political groups. They rarely actually win elections. They usually have to take over power through some kind of coup or violence or military action. And I think that says a lot. I think that tells you that the problem isn't Islam. The problem isn't Middle Eastern culture. Your average everyday human doesn't see that as what should be going on. The problem is those people and their deep desire to control and have power and to get back at the people that they feel have wronged them and their possibilities in the world. In the same way that like Hitler, was that. He wasn't a German, and we can't just say that every German is Hitler. We say that Hitler was a person who looked at his world and was suffering and saw the suffering in his world that was caused by politics of the past. And he used that anger and frustration and powerlessness to develop a social system that was evil at the heart of it. And that happens, that's a human thing. That's not just a, Europe versus Middle East versus anybody else thing. That's what we tend to do. And so we have to remember that, when we look at these radical governments and the things that they do, we're not looking at the people. Even if it's a democracy, there's all kinds of stuff going on behind the scenes with corruption and dictatorial nature of things and punishment and fear and all this kind of control that's happening. But then once they get power, they have to use religious arguments to control the population. They have to convince people that their way of doing things is correct, not just because it's going to fix all their lives for them, even though it's not, but because that is what our religion dictates. And so if you don't do this, then you're not being a good Muslim. And so it's the use of Islam as a weapon, not Islam itself, that is creating a lot of the suffering and the corruption and the impoverishment and all of these problems that we see in the Middle East. And so because the governments are corrupt and because all this stuff is going on, you get a lot of charities that provide a lot of the civic services that we're used to coming from the government, like sewage and healthcare and that kind of stuff. But the ongoing taking advantage of social breakdowns and using the religion as supposedly the only solution to that kind of wraps Islam up into this tangled web that can never really be fully untangled, especially for an outsider who is just trying to understand a little bit of what's going on and how complicated it is from the outside, like we are. Sorry, we're getting really late. So this is the last slide and then we'll wrap it up. So I just wanted to speak just really briefly about Islam in America, since the question was about Islam in general and not just about Middle Eastern Islam. In America, we've actually had Islam for hundreds of years. Africans who were brought to America as slaves, many of them were from countries that had Muslim populations. And so we had a lot of Muslim Africans coming as slaves to America, and they shared their traditions and kept some of those beliefs and systems and practices going even as slaves. After abolition, some people who were not Muslim Africans converted to Islam, and then again during the civil rights movement there was a huge conversion to Islam among African American populations, because Islam was associated with liberation, the liberation struggle against white Christians. So Christianity is for white people, and that's all about control and, you know, slavery and all this. But we see this fresh new perspective where everyone is equal, and, you know, we're all treated the same and under God, and there is possibility here for me. And so a lot of people converted to Islam for that reason. So you have a lot of African and African American Muslims in America. But then we also have Muslim immigrants, you know, more recent, and it's often people who are from the Middle East or from the Asian subcontinent. And those people often bring their own racisms from their home countries. And so there's often a lot of tension, even within communities of Muslims from different regions or of different skin colors or cultures. Sometimes you'll see, especially in the urban areas, you'll see that there is a mosque that seems to be mostly for Black Muslims who, you know, are longtime Americans, and then you'll see one that is for brown Muslims who are, you know, more recent immigrants. Maybe they're second or third generation or fourth at the most, and they have different competing ideas about what it means to be a Muslim, and they kind of don't get along with each other very well. And so I think this brings up kind of a question of, you know, what is essential to being a Muslim? What makes someone a Muslim? You obviously can't assume that everyone does the same cultural things because they all come from different places and different backgrounds. But so what is important? Is it important to maintain certain cultural traditions? Is it important to stay close to like-minded people? When you are living in America and you don't have that full support of the whole community, it's really hard to find the time to pray. You know, when we plan a meeting at a certain time in the afternoon, we're not thinking about, oh, well, we shouldn't have the meeting at that time because anybody who's Muslim that comes to that meeting might, you know, not be able to come because they should be in prayer at that time. It's really easy for us to forget about those types of differences.
So Katie, how long do they have to pray?
It depends on the day and what's going on in their lives. Like I talked about the cycles and, you know, the words that are involved in it, and of course, like different holidays, you're supposed to do special extra things on top of it and that kind of thing. So it really.
But if you had a meeting in the late afternoon and it was time for the late afternoon prayer, I mean, would they have to step out for more than a half hour?
No, not usually.
Okay. I mean, you just have to make room for that, I guess.
Yeah, and I think we need to do a better job, you know, as kind of the dominant culture of accommodating that and being aware of that as we work through. But, you know, again, that's just. And then, of course, there's a lot of peer pressure to change, you know, oh, I'm different because I do these things. And if you're a second generation immigrant or you're new and you want to fit in, are you going to continue to do those things that are part of your culture from your you know, the country that you came from, or are you going to try to embrace American culture? And, you know, where do you draw the line if you want to maintain, maybe you don't care so much about your culture, but you do care about your religion? What is essential to being a Muslim versus, you know, an Egyptian or an Iraqi or, you know, or a
Do they still do the 5 pillars? Is that a commonality?
Uh-huh.
Okay.
So coming back around to our original question, what is Islam? Well, obviously, there's a lot of complicated stuff going on to try to figure that out. There's a mixture of religion and politics and social norms and cultural traditions and regional assumptions and expectations, and those don't always pan out, especially when it comes to individuals who claim to be Muslim and what they believe is essential for their, you know, for their identity as a Muslim. We also have different ways of understanding. We've got ideas of, you know, the Sharia as something that should be cultural and normative and part of the government, but other people don't think that. Other people think that the Sharia is just something that's supposed to be internal. It's supposed to be personal. It's supposed to be about how I am choosing to live my life in the way that we say, you know, following Jesus and doing what Jesus did is how I choose to order my life. Nobody's telling me that I must do that, but that's part of my personal piety. Some people think that the Sharia is the same way. You know, some people think that Islam is a set of cultural ideas and practices. and that and other people think that it's the only legitimate political system. It must be used in all political systems, because without it, it's wrong. God gave us this, and so it's obviously the only way to govern ourselves. And so there are lots of different ways of understanding and different contexts for this. And then, of course, we've also got challenges of determining how to be a Muslim in a non-Muslim culture. How do I practice my faith when other people around me aren't? So I wanted to just share with you one thing that I think might help us a little bit with this, is that the word Islam means submission, and a Muslim is someone who submits. And of course, the submission is to God, and you are submitting to God. And so that actually kind of expands our potential understanding of Islam, because anyone who submits to God can have a Muslim heart, even if they aren't practicing Islam. So that makes it even bigger. What is this? What does this mean? And so I think it's important for us to kind of understand that Islam isn't just one thing, that every Muslim that you encounter, if you ask them that question, is going to answer it very differently. And that, it's not up to us to decide and judge and decide what is and isn't right. Certainly there are, some human rights stuff that I think we can say that's not right, but do we just then assume that those ideas come from this religion, or can we be a little bit more generous than that and say that there is a possibility for a variety of perspectives, including some perspectives that are illegitimate and harmful to everyone, including the people who are perpetrating them.
Katie, I hate to break this up and leave, but I've got to go.
Yes, sorry. I also have to go. I have a meeting right now. This is my last slide. I just wanted to share with you this combination. There's a surah from the Quran that talks about how God is the source of all true guidance, and that we are commanded to surrender to God, and so that you can be gathered into God. And I thought that really matched up with 1 Peter chapter 5, where it talks about how we should humble ourselves to God because God cares about us, because God will establish us and restore us and strengthen us. And so, we have a lot more in common with these people than we think. So that's where I wanted to leave you for today. So thank you for tolerating my long-windedness, and take care. Next week we'll talk about, was Jesus married? And
okay. Have a good
All
week.
right.
all right. Thanks everybody.
Good to see you. Bye-bye.
Bye.